Welcome to the 2019 Gallup Learning Series. My name is Micah Librant, and on behalf of the learning team, thank you for joining us today. We are so excited to have you here for a week of learning offered exclusively for you, a Gallup certified strengths coach. We have a great lineup plan for you. If you haven't taken a look at that agenda, do so. You'll notice that it is packed with various Gallup experts, all sharing insights on how to help you increase your effectiveness in your role as a CliftonStrengths coach. We're going to share key insights from our latest research about the importance of managers and the role that the manager truly plays in the workplace. As a coach, you are positioned to help managers be more effective in their roles. And we know, probably instinctively, but certainly key research findings have underscored the importance of the manager in truly transforming a workplace from just some place you go to work to a truly exceptional place. That's how we increase per person productivity. That's how we change the world. So we want to empower you to feel connected to that and ready to make a difference. Folks, it's a great time to be a strengths coach. We're seeing more and more organizations that are hungry for ways to develop their leaders, things to offer their managers on that development track. And here too, we know that coaches play a vital role in supporting organizations' focus on development. Needless to say, as you can see, we've got a lot to share, and we're very excited to bring this Gallup certified coach community together. We have an entire week through this beautiful virtual platform to really be able to invest in you, to honor who you are and the work that you do, and elevate that work to the next space. Couple key logistics as we're starting. The learning series will include 8 topics over the course of the week. This is the 5th time we've ran this series, so it's a bit of a celebration on our end, and I hope it feels that way for you too. Every session is going to be recorded, so don't fall into that fear of missing out if I just said 8 and you realized you hadn't gotten them all on your calendar. You can catch anything that you might not be able to watch live. You can also play that back on demand at a time that works for you in the future, or think about perhaps reviewing the content a second time. You'll want to refer to your participant guide throughout the week for the details associated with each session. You'll notice if you've already downloaded that participant guide that every session will have a slightly different take on how interactive we'll be with that guide, but it really is a wonderful place to say, okay, focus your energy. Don't make your brain be the only place that you hold information. Make sure that it spills out into a space that you can keep it. For today's topic, you'll want to turn to page 2. And just a note, as today is our kickoff, if you're still looking for that, still searching for it, the link has been put into our chat group a few times. The link for that participant guide is also in the email that you received as part of your registration. I mentioned that you can watch these recorded. However, you should also know 7 of our 8 sessions have been approved by ICF for core competency training hours. This session has been approved for 1 core competency training hour for those people who are attending live. So if you're hoping to get 7 core competency training hours, that means you will need to attend 7 of them live. But what a fantastic perk that there's very few places where you can find those continuing education hours where the legwork's already been done for you to make sure that it counts, and it's offered as a perk of your investment already. I will provide more information at the end of our session about how to obtain those credits, how to really make that happen as we wrap up today. So how can you be involved? Today, we really want to make sure that we're hearing your questions, that we're using this just as if we were all in one live classroom together. So we've reserved the chat for your questions and your comments. You might find that there's hundreds of people here today, so you might find that you ask a question and it sort of floats away pretty quickly. Feel free to either ask it again. Also, if you see a question that you know the answer to, participate. We're all here to support each other. We'll do the best we can to get through all your questions. And please feel free to type them anytime you have that question. Anytime I teach a virtual course, I like to tell folks that you should think about that area as what you might be whispering to your neighbor. If it was important enough to come through your brain and out your mouth, it's important enough to type into the chat. Today's guest is one of my mentor coaches and absolutely one of the coaches who's been the closest to the development of CliftonStrengths since it was just an idea into truly making it effective every single day. Jackie Merritt is an ACC and a senior practice consultant here at Gallup. Her top 5 themes are woo, maximizer, input, focus, and connectedness. A bit about Jackie. She provides consulting and executive coaching really to leaders all around the world. She's been with Gallup since 1989. And in that time, Jackie has helped leaders and managers maximize their effectiveness by providing insights on how they can build and apply their leadership capabilities. She's consulted with many of Gallup's US based and international clients on everything from team building, succession management, talent, and executive development. Today, Jackie's here to share with us very specifically some tips and techniques around how do we use the new CliftonStrengths 34 report. Our new report is packed with valuable information and opportunities for you to explore with your clients. It's 25 pages long. So as a coach, I think this is a moment where we need to realize that we are doing the hard work of getting out maybe 2 steps in front of what our clients know so that we can make sure we're not sort of stumbling through at the same time that they are. Jackie has so much great advice to bring to us, and we thank you for being here. Jackie, thanks for joining. We're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Micah. It's fun to see you. And I wish I could see everybody else. I have a feeling there's a lot of familiar faces out there. So I'll say hello to everybody that I know in the community and welcome to those who are maybe seeing and joining us for the first time. So I have been super excited to talk about our new report. It feels like a long time in coming. I can remember it was about 10 years ago. We had a retreat with our higher education group, and we had this futurist come and speak to us. And he actually had a copy of his own report. And he said to us, you guys got to get into the 21st century because this is really hard to process all this information. And I think once we decided that we were going to kind of dive into the new report, it happened very fast. And I think it happened so fast because of the input that all of you have provided to us through the years. So we have heard from you and we listened. We've heard that the theme definitions were too long, they were hard to read. So we tried to chunk things, to put frameworks in there. We heard that some of the strengths insight statements didn't really match the themes. So we tried to take those out. We heard some of the theme definitions were hard for people to accept, in particular significance. I don't know if anybody noticed that we changed some of the language on that to fit more how people express that theme. And I think we tried to put some emotional kind of hot spots in there as well, because we want people to really feel that material. It's not just something that they read on the page. We really want them to interact with it. And so we took all of that advice and kind of pulled that together in the report. We had many different versions of them that we looked at before we landed on this one. So I'm going to walk you through, initially, I'm going to just walk you through some of those hot spots in the report, some of the things that I've noticed in my coaching that people are reacting to, kind of where they want to go in their heart and their mind and what resonates, and maybe some things that hints that you can give to them about how to navigate through the report. And then we'll talk about how to coach around the report. And I'm sure you have a ton of questions, and I don't have all the answers at this point. I've been using it, I want to say, since October, but maybe the population of people I'm working with is a little bit different than some of the people that you're encountering. So I hope that we can have some interactive dialogue around that too. So I'll try to stop and pause occasionally so we can get all of your questions answered around this new report. So
hey, Jackie, before you kick that off, your volume dipped a little bit on us for me again. If I can have you grab that mic and bring it just as close to you as we can get it.
How about that?
I think we'll try with that. We'll see how that goes.
Okay, and if it's a problem, maybe there's something I can set it on.
Is it? No, let's keep going, and we'll go from there. I don't want to take too much time and lose the content. Let's keep going.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I actually pulled a copy of my own report that I'm going to kind of showcase here. So first thing, obviously, is that first page, and that's usually where I go first. So a couple things about that. I'll just give you a little bit about some of the discussion that went on here and some of the things that people are, noticing here. When you talk about the first page, one of the things that's different, obviously, is we've got the top 10 singled out instead of just your signature themes. Where we used to focus so much on that top 5, I think what we've recognized over the years is people who get that full 34 report are more than 5 things, and they start to look at 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and they see a lot of themselves in those top 10. And even in 11 and 12 up here, you may have some clients who really resonate with those. So we really wanted to draw more attention to that top 10. Not that we're getting away from the signature themes, but we wanted to just give people a lot more opportunity for rich discussion. The other thing you might notice is that we didn't single out the bottom 5, right? So one of the versions we did, and what we found is that people that we showed it to, and we showed it to clients, and we showed it to some of you, they thought those were their weaknesses. And we didn't want to leave them with that impression, because a lot of people look at those on the bottom and they think those are just non-talents, lesser themes. They really aren't what they would describe as their weaknesses. And so we thought, let's just take that confusion out and leave all the rest of them here. The other thing I think that people are drawn to immediately is the statement, you lead with, and then we list the name of the domain, CliftonStrengths. So that's something that we used to reserve kind of for the end. We used to talk about, like, don't introduce that too soon, because it kind of gets people hung up on this framework that maybe can have some pros and cons to it. So we did decide to lead with it right here. And we wanted you to be able to talk about that right away as a framework. And so where a lot of people want to go after they kind of discover that piece of their power, they want to go straight to page 21, which is kind of another neat page that I love. And I almost think about this report, and maybe you should experiment with this a little bit. I think about, this is page 21, I think about it kind of as a pull apart report. So I don't even want to put a staple in this thing. I did just because it's easier for me not to get mixed up, as I'm walking you through it. But there are so many pages. If I'm coaching somebody, I want to lay those in front of them almost together. Page 1, page 21, page 22, which is some action statements. And so I won't show that to you right this minute, but I think just think about that, just kind of pulling out some of those ones that can create some really interesting dialogue right away. I'll just note that page 2, for those of you who are not as familiar with this report, page 2 is totally generic. Okay, nothing special, unique on that page. We did separate out the top 5, as you know, into 2 pages apiece. So here's my first page of that with a little bit of chunking, a little bit of color on it. The only thing that's unique about this page is the why your woo is unique. Okay, so on the top 5, we did include the strengths insight statements there. We cleaned them up and we minimized them. So there's not as much there, but what we maintained was the really important stuff. And if you want to kind of think back around where those strengths insight statements came from, they're not, I'll say this and then I'll explain it. They aren't theme based, they're item based. So let's imagine that one of the items is I like to read and the other side is I like to entertain. And then, 10 minutes later, they get a different set of items. I like to influence versus I like to encourage. If they chose I like to read and I like to encourage, they're going to get a combined statement that describes somebody who claimed both of those statements. And the woman who wrote this, Rosemary Travis, spent about a year of her life using these combined statements, these paired up statements, and writing these insights. She chose the rarest combinations. So this is where people are most unique. So she looked at all the data and what doesn't generally come up together. And she started with those. And there are thousands and thousands of those strengths insight statements. So any questions about this so far? I'll stop for a second, mostly so I can get a drink of water.
Jackie, some feedback. We got a love in all caps, that explanation. I have to tell you, I also really love that they're not theme based, but they're item based. A quick question. I don't know if this is the right question for you or for someone else, but kind of simple question from Anne. Is there a reason there's not a cover page on the report? It was helpful when you were printing it in book format.
Oh gosh. We did talk about that, and we wanted to hit people right away with that DNA strand and their own 34 right away.
That's excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about that DNA strand and how that is pulled together? I think sometimes it's great to realize that that is individualized. It's not just a cool graphic.
Yeah, so that segments, DNA segments, your talent DNA in order, all 34 color coded by your domains. So whichever domain is attached to that theme, you can kind of see the pattern there, and see if like all of your yellow are in one area, all of your red are in one area. It just kind of gives you a snapshot. And I'll tell you a funny story. So one of our first versions of the report, we didn't have the DNA strand, we didn't have the list there, but we had statements that were connected to a person's top 5 themes right there on the front page. And then we also had a statement connected to their bottom theme that said, "This is who you're not." And it was funny because people just didn't resonate with it. It was like they didn't care. They didn't care who they weren't. And maybe this is because we were, working with people who are familiar with strengths. But if you think about that, you look at the bottom of your report, there's some themes down there that just kind of feel neutral to you. And that's because as you go through and make those choices, sometimes you're going in the middle. Sometimes you're like, nah, neither one of them really suit me. Those are all kind of, I'll say, neutralized. So that's sometimes what ends up at the bottom. So there's not always an emotional reaction to those.
Mm-hmm.
But we wanted to create some emotional reaction. So that's where the blind spots come in. And if you notice on all of those top 10 themes, whether it's the top 5 or 6 through 10, we do have a couple statements in there about blind spots. And sometimes people ask us where those come from. And those actually come from our coaching experience. So those are not scientifically generated. Those just come from really thinking about what are the most common kind of speed bumps that come up for people when they feel like their strengths when they get the volume almost turned up too high, or they're with people who don't appreciate those talents, or with people who are wired a lot differently. What are some of those traps that they can fall into? And for a lot of people, those are not blind spots. They're well aware of what those things are. But it creates a lot more, I think, dialogue, and it opens up a lot more dialogue around how people can maybe master their themes more intentionally, and just be more mindful of some of those differences between themselves and others.
Jackie, how individualized are where we go through and we have, I want to say customized, but I'm not sure they are, statements of how to build on each of those top themes, including the blind spots? Is that going to be more similar to the insight report where it's based on your unique makeup? Or is that going to be, when we say based on our coaching and our coaching experience, does that make it more sort of specific to each theme?
Yeah, so the only thing that is going to be different is that's going to be unique in the report are those strengths insight statements around the top 5. Blind spots don't vary. It's theme based.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Super helpful.
So if I have woo, my blind spots are the same as yours if you have woo. So,
Okay, great.
okay.
We've got a lot of great feedback here, and I think a lot of great questions when we go into like page 21 and beyond around what you previewed around the domains. Do you want to take those now, or do you want to go
Yeah.
where you had planned?
Let's go to domain. So I'll just say a couple things about page 21, and then I can answer some questions around it. So you'll see mine here. Okay, so just personal story on this. You'll see that I have, maybe you can't see this, but I have 3 of my dominant themes in strategic thinking, 3 in relationship building, 2 in influencing, and 2 in executing. So I've been walking around for the last 20 years thinking my dominant domains are kind of strategic thinking and relationship building. So when I got my report, I was very surprised to see My dominant domain is influencing. Okay, even though I only have 2 themes there, and I've had clients where this pops up too. And it's a little bit confusing at first, but the reason that is because it's the distribution across all 34 themes that determines your most dominant domain. So we aren't just looking at the top, whoops, wrong page. We aren't just looking at the top 10. We are looking at all 34 themes. When there's a special way that we calculate this, and you'll see the distribution up here on that bar. So whatever you lead with, kind of next, and then you can kind of get a feel for how dominant or how intense that domain is. So it's interesting because when I learned that influencing was my dominant domain, all of a sudden I felt more influential. I don't know why that is, but it's the
You wanted to
power.
tell everyone about it.
Yeah, I always thought the other two were where I lived, but it's funny how labeling things really influences how people are able to step into some of those strengths. So, what are the questions that you're seeing mostly around this page?
Um, do items, well, just kind of questions I think about that algorithm. Do items in the top 10 have a higher weighting? Can you just
No.
explain to us a little bit about how that could happen? Where you only have 2 influencing, but that's what you lead with?
Yeah, so I'll do my best Jim Asplund here, who's our chief scientist. He would say it's based on the distribution across all 34, and there's no weighting for your top 10 themes. So we artificially, just so you know, we kind of artificially draw the line. We used to draw it top 5, very heavy line, and then kind of a dotted line on top 10, and then everything else. There really are no lines statistically, but Jim will say that your top 10, you do see a little bit more of an intensity drop off where it gradually declines more after that. And so that's why 10 and not 12 or not 8 is because statistically that's where it seemed like the split kind of happened. And then the bottom 5 are also pretty stable. So if you go through the and do the test retest and go through it again, what you'll find is that your bottom 5, they'll jumble up a little bit and jumble around, but they are pretty stable.
So, another question from Larry: how does the new report impact the team strengths grid going forward?
It should not impact that at all. So when you see, if you have access to Gallup Access, you should be able to run all those team reports that we run, and it's using to create the team theme sequence at the top. Any of those those of you who are familiar with that, you'll know there's a theme sequence at the top. That's how that's calculated. So
Great.
it
So it's sort
takes
of
that
already set
whole.
up to take that
Mhm.
into account.
Yeah, so the team reports don't really look different. They don't look like this.
Great. Jackie, I think we're curious, just going beyond the logistics of the report. How do you coach somebody using this? Let's say maybe who had the same experience you did, where you're walking around your whole life thinking you were in a different power, and you realize now you lead with influencing. What was that like for you, and how have you coached clients through it who might have had a similar experience?
Well, a lot of questions, I think. So my kind of framework, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, is really listen or ask, listen, and tell, right? So and it's kind of a 3-step, that I cycle through all the time. So it would be like if they have an insight around that's new to them, they might have questions around what does that mean? And I would say, that's where your strongest power is. That's where your power lives. So it's something you step up into pretty easily. And then I would throw it right back at them and ask them, is that something that you see in yourself? Or in what ways do you see that expressed in your own, day-to-day life? Where do you see that show up? So I would start to get them to dig into it a little bit. Um, and not try to over explain the arithmetic on it, other than to say it's based on your full 34.
Mhm.
So
That's
I would,
really powerful. I think we've got a lot of questions sort of directly hitting it, trying to figure out that problem. And there's a question here even about, can we have a simple FAQ with the most common statistical weighting answers to minimize the time spent in team sessions? Jackie, what you just said, I think is just don't lead them that way, right? Help them understand it's based on who you are, which includes who you're not, and then throw it right back.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk about prep on this, for coaching sessions, which I think is, for me, it's been just a little bit different, not a whole lot different. But I do probably spend more time on the strengths insight statements. I used to look at the strengths insight statements so that I could be aware of what was going to trip them up, because there were some in there, especially with some of the themes like relator, that didn't really match relator. And I knew they were going to say, like, what's relator? Because it sounds like achiever. So now I really go through it just to kind of feel my way through the insight statements to understand and imagine how they might react to those, because some are a little bit more emotionally jarring than others. I know in my own report it says I like to control right in my focus theme. And I think, oh, so there's some things that people are going to react to, and you want to kind of react first, and be aware of those. And then I do look at the domains and be prepared for some of those questions like we just got around, why do I only have 2 of my top 10 in influencing, but it's my dominant theme. So I want to kind of be ready for that. Um, I usually try to pull something together that's not in the report. So I get a lot of people, and you may find this as well, where they say to me, what do I need to watch out for? Or they have general questions around, tell me what you see. You're the expert. I want to know what you see. And so I always want to kind of have in my back pocket some answers to that, answers that maybe aren't in the report. So I'll spend some time kind of thinking about that sequence of themes and what that means in terms of how they're motivated, how they, I think across the domains, I want to look at where the distribution is, but I also recognize everybody executes, everybody builds relationships, everybody influences, and everybody thinks and processes information in their head, but it's how they do that. And so I really try to figure out my own theory around that. Or if I see a couple of themes that in combination mean something based on, kind of what I know about people like that. Like, I was listening to a recorded coaching session from one of my colleagues the other day, and they were coaching somebody who had empathy and adaptability in their top 5. And when I see those two together, I think this person might have difficulty with boundaries because they want to please and they want to respond and they're in the now. So in my head I'm thinking, okay, that may come up. And it did come up, and because I've seen it before, I was able to coach the coach on how to handle that maybe differently the next time. So I think there are things that come up, like, another example might be something like responsibility and positivity. I think, and you'll see some of these in the Paired Up book, by the way, the Kurt Liesfeld Paired Up book. But sometimes when I see those together, I notice that people make a lot of promises that are hard to keep because they kind of underestimate the time that it takes to complete their responsibilities. Like, they want to commit and want to take ownership, but they're sometimes overly positive about how long it's going to take to achieve that or follow through on that. So I try to kind of write some of those things down, or at least just be aware of those. And even some things like, I notice rare themes too, like command, self-assurance, significance. Sometimes you'll see 2 or even just one of those in the top 5. And even just throwing back at somebody, hey, were you aware that significance is one of the rarest themes on the strengths profile? You know, what does that mean to you? Just kind of throwing that out. I think anything you can do to give that person some unique kind of flavor of who they are. And these are assumptions, right? So you kind of want to test them out with questions.
What do you suggest a client does before they get to you with this new report? Is there any place that you tell them they should really study so that you're not both going into it, just sort of walking them through the logistics of it?
Yeah. So when it comes, I don't really do anything specific. I will tell them to, read the report before we get together. I still use the old highlighting, highlight or note what really resonates with you. But I do find a vast extremes in terms of how much people will dig into the report, even with that guidance. And it's really dependent probably on how they're wired and how they learn best. Some people won't really look at it at all. They'll look at the first page, even if I tell them to read the whole thing. Other people will dig in and, have things highlighted and pages turned and things like that. So I think I go into my coaching sessions almost with the mindset of like a tour guide. So I think if I'm a tour guide, I want to know a little bit about the person that I'm guiding before I'm taking them on the tour. I'm
Hmm.
going to kind of sit down with them and ask them, initially the same questions we always ask, what's important for me to know about you? What do you hope to take away from this session? What's most interesting for you about this? Or what are you most curious about? So I'm kind of throwing it out to them. Initially, it's kind of, again, that ask, listen, and tell framework that I'm going with. Um, because and I'm going to ask them, how familiar are you with your report? Um, and then I kind of know, where do I want to stop along the way? What's going to be those places? Because in that explanation, sometimes you're hearing where they want to go. They'll say something like, I'm not surprised to see, an entire desert in strategic thinking, you know? And so that's like, that you're going to go to the domains, right? Or I'm not surprised to see empathy as number 34, or I am surprised to see empathy number 34, right? So you're kind of gathering those clues as to where you're going to stop on that journey, if that makes sense. But yeah, I don't really give them any specific details about anything else to pay attention to in the report. I'll just say, pay attention to the things that matter to you.
So, Jackie, you've been using this with individuals since you said about October.
Mhm.
How has it changed people's questions? Has it changed their initial reaction when you start to do that sort of, how well do I know you? How well do you know this report? What have you noticed in how maybe that's affected your clients?
I don't notice big differences other than the domains. So because we never threw those out to them really in any of the reports except for strengths-based leadership,
Hmm.
or if we were doing a team session. So that's a place that they want to go, and we go pretty quickly. So we will turn like from the first always start with the first page, kind of on my tour, and then I take them to page 21. To once we hit that domain statement on that page one, I'll say, and let's jump to page 21, and we'll look at that overview, and I'll just give them, that short, like that top line at the top, is based on the intensity of the themes across all 34. And you'll see your top 10 kind of jump out at you, so you can see the pattern there. So they might have a couple of questions around that. But that's probably the place where I spend a little bit more time, but not overly do that. I try to move them back into kind of looking at their themes individually,
Mm.
after I explain it to them, unless it's something like the woman who says, I have a desert in strategic thinking. Then I kind of lay out, that idea that, and it's because she had absolutely nothing in strategic thinking, not one of her top 10. And I think the first thing that popped up was maybe like a number 15. So I said, well, everybody thinks and processes information. That, let's talk about for a minute, why did that not surprise you? And so she shared a little bit about how that led in the influencing domain, why that was not a surprise to her, and that she really didn't like school, and that, she didn't like to learn. She liked to make decisions quickly and kind of be in the middle of the action. But I learned that that wasn't a self-limiting thing for her in the way that she explained it. She didn't see it as a problem. It was just something she was kind of laughing about, but not a place that she needed to go right away. So I was almost feeling bad when she said that, thinking, oh, she thinks that she's not smart or something. But she wasn't thinking that. She absolutely, owned that that wasn't a place that she went first. Yet she was the valedictorian of her class because she was an achiever and she was competitive. So that's where that came from. Yeah. So I think, figuring out kind of who that person is and what they're really stuck on initially, because sometimes they get stuck. And when they get stuck on something, you want to find out, is that something that you need to go to right away? Just in terms of explaining the report. Like the one people get stuck on quite a bit, I think, is empathy being low. I coach a lot of people where that shows up pretty low, yet a lot of them have high individualization. So I'll explain and say, individualization is almost like an intellectual empathy, and empathy is more like an emotional empathy. And then they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I see why that's really low. So you want to like have those short little things where you can kind of help to move them back to their power when they get stuck on things that are not who they are.
It sounds like you're having great coaching conversations that are around the introduction phase. And maybe that's because it's the way that the coaching session is designed. It's perhaps their first time. Maybe it's because it's their first time with this new tool. How do you define a great win on that first session? What are you aiming for? What are you promising the client that you're aiming for?
Yeah. So I say the same thing I've always said. Even though we have this new report, I always say my hope for you is that you walk away from this coaching session with at least one insight that you can turn into action to be a more effective leader, manager, coach, whatever it is that they're aiming at, that they've already shared with me. I'll say that to them right up front. And then, I'm navigating that discussion pretty similar. The name it, claim it, aim it is always kind of for me in the background. But I think there is, with this report, the risk of getting too focused on the report and not focused enough on the person. And so I go into the call kind of with some things in my mind. Like one of my mindsets is, and Kathy DeWeese, my colleague, and I, we both learned this from our mentor coach. It's focus on the who, not the what. So keeping the person at the center of the conversation and not the tool is really important. And keeping the person at the center of the conversation and not their problem that they're coming to coaching with. We never want to kind of sit around like, and I had this feedback before in a negative way, because my mentor coach was listening to my coaching session, and she said it sounded like you and your client were sitting shoulder to shoulder looking at a whiteboard trying to solve a problem. And she said, you need to turn around and look at your client face to face. And metaphorically, I wasn't doing that. We were just like really focused on this thing out here. And I think with this report, sometimes you can get into that fix too, where you're just like, you're looking at the report and you're both focusing on the report, and you need to kind of turn almost your attention, your emotion back to that person. How are they responding to the report? Where's their emotion? Where's their joy? What do they want to see movement on? What's most important to them? So really coaching that who rather than the what. And then being, in that same vein, being really curious to learn and not thinking you have all the answers. Like I also learned from our mentor coach that we're just like thin slicing people. We're meeting them only for a moment in time. We are not the experts in their life. We're the experts on the tool, but we don't know how those themes show up in their life. So really coming in with that mindset of curiosity rather than that teachy preachy mindset. Because I know a lot of us who do workshops and things like this, we can get teachy and preachy And we forget to be coachy. So I think it's
How do
really
we
important.
how do we notice when we're focusing on the person or the report or the problem or the report or something other than the person? Like can you think of some checks that we might keep in mind to make sure that we're pulling ourselves out of that habit and focusing back on the person?
I can think of like the techniques that I would use to do that. There's a few different ones. One of them is listen for the key words that they're saying. Um, what's the language they're using, either to describe themselves or to describe how they're feeling, and jot those down. If you're hearing repeated words, and then play it back to them. It's a technique that we teach in our advanced coaching workshop that we have, you and I are teaching it together. Yay.
Yeah. Good thing I got to ask you this now before I have to look
Yeah.
like I know the answer.
But one of the things we teach people to do is reflect back what you're hearing. And so if you're hearing them say the word um, busy 5 times, you might ask them something about that. You might just notice it. I notice you use the word busy 5 times. That feels like a loaded word. What does that mean to you? So I think keywords, reflecting them back. I think um, I'm listening for, and I think we all do this, we're listening for their talents and what they say. And so they might tell you a story, and we're kind of doing that strengths mining for strengths as we're listening. And I always feel like I don't have to play it back to them right away. Like, oh, I just heard your achiever show up, like sometimes we're tempted to do. I think you can kind of hold back on that and reserve it a little bit for when it comes up later. Like I had a coaching session the other day with a guy, and one of the first things he said to me when I asked him, like, what's important for me to know about you? He said, well, he was telling me about his career, and he said the board of directors offered me a raise, and I said no, I declined it because I work for a nonprofit and money is not important to me. And
Mm.
in my mind, I'm like, oh my God, that was in his strengths insight statement. That very same thing said, you value making a difference in the lives of others more than you value money. It was in his belief statement. But I didn't like rush to, ooh, look at, I read your report. Um, I waited until that came up later around some of his values and some of his decisions. And I said, I noticed when you were telling me about yourself, you mentioned that. And it's actually, it's in your belief theme. And then we had this wonderful discussion around how his values have shaped his life. So I think you can always be like jotting down when you hear that. And if it's relevant, play it back later. I think staying focused on the person is also about listening for emotions, where you hear their voice rise and fall, where you hear nervous laughter, and play it back to them. You're the observer, you're the mirror in the coaching session. So if they're talking about a theme and they kind of make a remark about it not being a strength for them, like maybe they say, oh, my activator, I never saw that as a strength, and they start to laugh. You can even say, okay, I heard a story behind that laughter.
Mm.
What's what does that mean for you when you say that? So I think paying attention to emotions is really paying attention to that person. So those are some of the things that I'll listen to.
There's a great question here that I think, Jackie, just listening to you, you've mastered the choreography between the person, the coaching, and the report. I think that sometimes it's real easy to drop any one of those in pursuit of the others.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you've said explicitly is you prepare, right? You go through and you read this report and you come up with maybe what's not in the report. And it's difficult to do that if we don't have our baseline understanding of those themes. There's a question from our friend Carrie, who was in that course last summer. She says, that piece around intellectual empathy was a great gem for her. And her questions is, how can we as coaches build Jackie Merritt level fluency so that we can be able to do this better? What would you say to that?
Oh gosh, I would listen to Theme Thursday. I think that's a treasure trove of how themes show up differently in different people. I think Call to Coach is another series you can look at. And I think just jotting down those insights as you have them in your coaching session. Sometimes I move quickly from one coaching session to the other, and I kind of have to dump the person to move on to the next one. But I think if you can just jot down some of those, maybe keep a journal where you have, a theme name on every page, and you can just whip through and write some of those insights, and because you'll use them again. I learn all of this from the people that I coach.
Mm.
They
Here's
teach me.
that's great. And I would say the same thing. We in your certified coach coursework, you've got that giant book where you've got space, right? To say, here's how I noticed this. Jackie, I love that ask, listen, and tell, because that means we're committing to staying curious about building that fluency. A couple more questions in here are a little bit more around logistics. How much time do you give somebody for their first coaching, really the first feedback call? And what does that really look like when it's at its best?
We would at Gallup, everything's on the hour. So that's how we book things. And we found that to be it works for us. I don't think there's any reason you can't have a longer conversation or a shorter conversation. I think can be equally effective. I don't think you want to cover everything about that report. That's something, let yourself off the hook of thinking that you have to like take them on a tour of the entire report when you're just sitting with them the first time. You wouldn't do that to a person who's coming to visit your hometown. You would focus on the things that maybe are interesting to them, and just do kind of a quick sweep through some of it and see where those hot spots are for them, see where they kind of want to focus. I don't feel a need even to go through all top 5 in that first session. Again, I think it's really taking the cues from them initially about what's important to them to walk away with. And sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they'll say, well, I want to know what this can tell me about, being more effective in my role, and you start to have that conversation, and then things start to open up and you figure out where they're not as effective and where they could be more effective, where they could lean into their, talent themes in a more intentional way. So I think however long that person has for that first discussion, having a coaching conversation is better than not having one.
Hmm.
So I could probably sit and have a conversation with some of my clients for 8 hours, and I have done that before. I had one guy fly in to spend the day. He loved his report, and he said, "I want to spend the whole day with you talking about my strengths because I'm in a career transition, and I want to know, what this can tell me about where I'm going next." And we had, did not run out of things to talk about. Now, partly that was his personality, as he wanted to process that way. So you kind of have to think about how people learn best. If you've got somebody with a lot of intellection, they might want to go away and process it after they have that first conversation with you, and then come back and go deeper. I've thought a lot about that idea of like, how do you package this up, right? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about like, is this going to look different, with this report? And I think it can look different. I think there's a couple ways to do it. One is to actually package it as a sequence of conversations, like let's say 3 conversations. The first one, you're going to kind of do an overarching get to know and, think about how to live a stronger life using
Hmm.
your talent themes, maybe, and you just do the tip of the iceberg, and maybe that's like getting familiar with the report, start with some of the top 5, and then the next report, it's really a deeper dive, probably into some of the themes you didn't touch on the first time, anything they experimented with in between those 2 sessions that they want to share. You might go through 6 through 10. That third session, you could get to some of those things that get in their way, some of the blind spots if you haven't touched on them already. But I would say in a three call series, you want to make sure that people are walking away with some kind of action plan, probably that they're generating on their own. I don't think you always need to give them a template for that. I think that I would throw it back at clients and say, you create something, a one pager. Some people want to be really visual, some people want to be very linear and set goals and SMART goals. But I think you want to have them walk away with some kind of roadmap with a couple of insights for them to activate their strengths in more intentional ways and work around those things that aren't as strong for them. So I think that's one option. The other one is probably to do it the way that I do it, which is I start with the report, but I'm really focusing on the who. I may have a coaching session with the person every single month, and I've always got that report right in front of me so we can reference it when things come up, and reference it in terms of action plans. Like page 22, I think I mentioned that's just a great pull out page um, to put on your wall about how to live your strongest life using your top 10. So I think you can just pull out the report when you need it, or you can sequence around the report.
Great. That answers the question I was going to ask you next, which was asked quite a bit earlier about how do you close with momentum. I had forgotten about that page that gives you the take action, but I think you're saying pretty clear. It depends on the client, right, and how they're going to think about action.
Yeah, and I think having them kind of have the last word.
Hmm.
That's something, again, Kathy and I learned from our mentor coaches, giving your client the last word in the coaching session. So asking them, even like, what discoveries have you made about yourself through this conversation, or what do you want to, make sure you don't forget, or are there any last questions you have, or how do you want to end this session? We're getting it. It's time to wrap up. How do you want to end? I think is a great
Mm.
question.
Jackie, on that note, it's almost time to wrap up. How do you want to end?
I guess I'll say I know it's kind of overwhelming to have this new report. And I was feeling a little bit nervous about it too when it first came out. I thought, oh, how am I going to coach people around this? Go with what you know already, and see what kind of questions your clients have that are a little bit different. And don't worry about knowing everything, because you're still going to know more than your clients do.
Mm.
Um, and I think, it's a rich treasure trove of information about a human life, and that discussion can go on forever. So I'm still like having amazing insights as I pull my own out, and I really wish I had somebody to coach me on it. So maybe Micah, you might be my person.
Well, Jackie, this is going to be feel like a little bit of a left turn at the cost of my high communication, which is I just want to wrap it up now because that was so beautifully said. But we do have I think a couple more questions that have come up. If you've got a second,
Yeah.
One might go back to something we started at the very beginning. There were several folks who I think are just struggling with how do we explain intensity to our clients. And since we've got you here and we can do probably a little bit more of just the bit more than go with what you know. They're still struggling with what if, how do I have three strategic thinking themes in my top 10, but it doesn't somehow balance what my leading with domain is. What's the best way, again, just to encapsulate that in a way that somebody can understand that intensity piece?
I wouldn't go into intensity. Intensity is a whole different world. So those of you who maybe kind of know more about how the Strengths Finder was designed initially, is we did like, if you looked at my first report that I ever had, it was a bar chart report that had intensity bars across each of my themes. And that report was not helpful for people developmentally, because some
Hmm.
people had like long bars everywhere, some people had short bars everywhere, and people just started comparing, and it got to be this big hairy ball that wasn't developmental. It was more comparative. And so we took all the intensity stuff out, and what you're seeing in your theme sequence is how you're self-rating each of those dominant themes relative to the other themes on the report. So when you're looking at, like, for example, my report, and you see that top 10 kind of popping out, but it doesn't look like influencing is in the top 10,
Hmm.
what you'll see is that my 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, that's what's pushing it up. It's not the top 10, it's what comes immediately after that. And so when you think about where that dominant domain comes from, it's a formula that looks at the full sequence. It's not just looking at top 10, it's looking at how they rank all the way down from top to bottom. So if, in the top half of your report, you've got more influencing themes, even though maybe they aren't just in the top 10. My number 1 and 2 are in influencing. So that kind of pushes it up a little bit more.
And I liked what you said of, you can go down in the weeds on this, but instantly you need to, at every moment that you can come up and take a breath, that breath is pushing it back on them and saying, how does this land for you? What do you think? What does that look like? Thanks, Jackie. I know that we need to reserve a little bit of time for some questions that Jim has promised to address throughout our time together. Jim, do you want to take that and then I'll close?
Yeah, let me just do 1 minute on Gallup Access because that came up and there's some confusion around that, and that's okay. We actually launched Access as a platform last summit. So last summer, we had, for folks who had the opportunity to join us for the summit, a chance to come in and look at it. Really ready for our enterprise clients. It's kind of enterprise driven. There's some costs associated with getting on the platform and some financial commitments to get there. It is the future of where we're heading. So eventually the Gallup Strengths Center, as you guys know it today, gallupstrengthscenter.com. And our CliftonStrengths or our Strengths Quest platform will be migrating, including Gallup Online, will be migrating into Access. So it's the future. A lot of coaches saying, can I get access to it right now? No, not right now. Not quite ready for the coaches yet. We want to make sure the code management piece is working. We have a plan to be able to migrate you and your customers onto Access to be able to have that to be smooth and consistent. And we really want you to have a really great experience. So today, a lot of times I get a lot of requests. Can you add, as an example, Jackie, you brought up the team grid. And in preparation, that's okay. In preparation for that movement, we have discontinued our support of the Excel-based team grid. Doesn't mean you can't use it. It's out there. There's versions of it available. I have it in the Facebook group. We're just no longer supporting that or making any changes to it going forward because all of our efforts are going towards making Access the platform of the future. So if you come to see us at the summit, June 3rd, 4th, and 5th, which, by the way, you should be signed up for. If you're not, the coaching discount is $100 off at this point, and the best time to do it is right now because the price is going to go up for everybody coming in March. You'll get a chance to see it again. We'll demo it out there. And then we'll keep you posted. Actually, Micah and I have committed to doing every other month updates for you on resources and what's going on in the community throughout the year. We'll be very clear in our communications with you about what is coming. By the way, I get a lot of questions from you, the community that lots of times we've answered. Jackie, by the way, thank you for the Theme Thursday and Called the Coach call out there. Micah and I and Mike McDonald and Dean Jones spend a lot of time communicating with you. If you came today and you have lots of questions and you can honestly say to me, look me in the eye and say, Jim, I'm not watching Called the Coach, I'm just saying you are missing out on an enormous resource, especially in Theme Thursday, where Micah and I telegraph a lot of the things that are going on in the coaching community. So as far as Access goes, hang tight. It's coming for you. We're putting some plans together we're recording this as of January 28th of 2019. If you're listening to it later, we may be in that process of going, it's coming. So hang tight. Micah, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you so much, Jackie. Don't forget, everybody, about ICF credits. If you attended live, this session is worth 1 core competency credit. So you might have felt the ICF gods smiling throughout most of that conversation, especially as Jackie was leading us through her key, I think, elements of keeping the person first. Watch for this event evaluation in your inbox on Friday. On that evaluation, you'll be asked to indicate which sessions you attended of our learning series and whether you attended live or through a recording. And then that professional credit verification information will be sent to you also through email as a result of completing the event evaluation. So that's coming on Friday. Don't miss it and don't skip over it. If you're watching the recorded version, you can earn 1 resource development hour for this session. That's per ICF's guidelines. Later in the week, I mentioned this in the chat, but later in the week, Jillian Anderson and Therese Nisbet are going to lead another session around how to use the CliftonStrengths 34 tool specifically for teams. I know a few of you had questions about that, and those will be, bring those questions back if we didn't hit on them today, build upon what you learned from Jackie, and really make the most of that. That in the US time is evening this Thursday. It's called Coaching Teams Using the CliftonStrengths 34 report. because we're real catchy with how we title things. There's also a new webinar series that'll be launching in early April about how to go really deep and think about using this report in your coaching. It will be a wonderful virtual way for you to expand well beyond what we did today, your expertise on that Clifton Strengths 34 report. Just in closing, I really hope you had an amazing event today and were able to focus on what we're doing here. I hope you'll join us again later today when I'll be back with tips and techniques to help you get more out of the coaching tools you already own. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, more importantly, for being a part of our Gallup coaching community. Bye-bye.